welcome to Other Lands Editing Podcast, where two speculative fiction writers and editors help you craft fantastical worlds by keeping an eye on exacting editing and foundational writing principles. Every 2 weeks, we bring you interviews with other writers, advice on editing and writers' craft pitfalls, and reviews of popular media to help you grow. So sit back, relax, and join Margaret Bates and Midnight Boss as we discuss all things writing and editing. Hi, this is Margaret Bates coming to you with Midnight Boss, and this week we have a bit of a mini-sode summarizing our time at the first annual Mid-Atlantic Romance Writers Conference that we went to last weekend in Randolph-Macon and Richmond, Virginia. So say hi to everybody, Midnight.
Hello.
Well, it was a good-sized event considering it was so new because I feel like they had 5 or 6 speakers if you include the keynotes and some breakout sessions that happened at the same time. And it covered a lot of different topics within writing, where you could go world building, or because it's romance writers, sex scenes, or just the importance of a writing community. So for a newer conference that also was kind of 1.5 tracks, it did cover a lot of material in the span of a day. The first thing I guess we can talk about is that really the big presentation, the big workshop of the event was all morning. We got a 2-part session from Ines Johnson about how she tackles especially plotting and comes in at it from a former scriptwriter's perspective a lot.
Yeah, we found that particularly useful. And the issue is that in describing it is that there's so much that she talked about. We could go on forever. It was literally 2.5 hours at some point. So she's applying her understanding via script writing to novels, which means that we get some of their breakdown terminology in the way that we handle these things. So she talked about a lot of different things. She talked about the meet cute and a ton of other things, but the specific ones that we wanted to draw attention to were creating tension and creating character empathy, the focus on a story question, and this term that she discussed called binary endings to help keep the tension going. So those were our major categories that we were looking at. Let me just talk really quick about creating character empathy because it does have to do with the way that they are trying to get you to attach the character very quickly. And you mentioned when we were talking about this before that it has to do with in that pilot episode of how quickly can you attach to these characters so that we care what happens to them. And they mentioned the save the cat thing where you have to have them do something heroic or good. And if they don't do something heroic or good, they need to be a character of extraordinary quality or be in an extraordinary world. And so, like, you capture our interest very quickly in order to get us to have some buy-in.
Yeah, and as when she went through it, she did use the example of the Buffy pilot, which makes sense because Buffy is supposedly on the surface an ordinary person. I mean, she's a slayer, but at first you think she's a blonde valley girl type in an extraordinary world with vampires and end of the world and prophecies. But I think one thing she did when she went through how to establish empathy and interest quickly in Buffy as like the series lead as a character in the pilot isn't just, she's good at slaying vampires and you see that towards the end of that particular episode of Welcome to the Hellmouth, but to establish empathy with her as someone who the viewers could like. And they do that by setting her up at the beginning of being sympathetic to really nerdy, really teased, really ostracized Willow Rosenberg when Cordelia's setting on her. And then later, obviously in the episode, she'll set out to go to the cemeteries to save Willow when she's about to be attacked by a vampire from the Bronze. So you get her physically as a hero, but you get to connect to her also empathetically, emotionally as someone who doesn't like necessarily stand for injustice or cruelty to other people, even in a casual setting. So it's 2 tracks of empathy, which is actually fairly clever. I think there are a lot of pilots where you kind of the pilot, if people don't know, is what they usually call the first episode of a TV show. It's usually shot before they even decide most of the time to green light a series to see if it'll work or if the cast works and to get the network to think it's, especially back in the day when we had mostly networks, a viable enough product to order 22 or 13 of them. But because it's traditionally, again, going back to when we had NBC, CBS, ABC was all you had like 40 minutes to get who are your lead characters, what is the plot of the week, do we care about them, and what is maybe the ongoing mystery that will get you to come back. TV by its nature, especially the old school TV, is very episodic. So what is going to be the draw to make you come back when it's just basically a procedural, and most of the time House solves somebody's weird virus? What else is like the give for that? But I think when Inez breaks it down, it's really smart because they, especially the way TV used to be run, they knew when you're writing a pilot, you have 40 minutes and you've got to make everything count, and it's got to grab attention really fast because someone can, in like 5 or 10 minutes, turn off your pilot and read a book or go to sleep or play a video game. So, how are you going to get people in and get them invested? And I think sometimes, because in writing and in novels, we have the luxury of a lot more pages to fill. Sometimes it's a little bit harder to realize we still have to create that empathetic connection with our lead character in the first couple of chapters. And it doesn't necessarily have to be like you were saying, they don't have to be someone you like. Like if you think about the TV show House, you don't like him. He's a jerk, but he's interesting or he's competent or he's very, very funny. So even if you're creating an anti-hero, it has to be someone that the readers will be invested in fast enough to get into saying, okay, I'll sit around for, I read the first 20 pages, I got to sit around for the other 300.
If you look at it by the questions that she was asking, is this not an extraordinary world? He does not really save the cat. They save them by the end, but that's not where they're showing him as a good person. It's that he's an extraordinary person in the ordinary world. So, in those cases where you have the main character who's just an asshole, who you don't like him, but he's interesting. And so that's where you get the hook for people being invested in him, as opposed to, say, Buffy, where she shows us that she is an empathetic character, that she's the person who goes out to do these things, and we should like her because she's the one who saves the little people. Moving forward, we have also that question of the story question. I like this one because she says, I think almost explicitly, I wrote this down, the human mind loves to close a loop. And this is one of the things that drives me batty about the way that people write sometimes, is that they don't recognize that we want some kind of satisfaction at some point. How would you describe a story question?
I think it's kind of setting up what is the mystery. I can give you a great example
Yeah.
because this ends up going really wrong. Twin Peaks, when it first came out, I'm not talking about the revival series, but I'm talking about the first season in like early 90s in ABC, I think. It was very addictive. People were super into it because it had one series question. It's one of the first shows like X-Files to have a season or a series long mystery and try and break away from the episodic nature. But the one thing that people were coming back to every week was who killed Laura Palmer. It's all set around a murder mystery, but its ratings really sagged in season two when it eventually got canceled because they weren't closing that loop. They were just adding more weird things and dream sequences. Or I also kind of like to liken it, at least from a TV perspective, to the smoke monsters on Lost. Like you started watching Lost in season one, you're like, this is going to get explained. And then all of a sudden you've got smoke monsters and a million other things that keep getting opened as questions, but you're not closing the initial question the pilot asked you. And so it is a fine line to opening new mysteries while you close other loops. So you know, I guess Veronica Mars tried to do that because the first season really is a mystery based around who killed her best friend. And that's why she went back into being PI and helping her dad. And then so the next seasons have other types of mysteries like a bus accident and stuff that come up. But yeah, I think one thing is that there is that tension of you're asking a question of the reader, especially if you're writing a mystery of some kind, and it has to eventually get solved. And maybe it leads into a new mystery or a new type of tension. But if you keep those loops open for too long, people really get frustrated with endless questions, but no sense of resolution or forward momentum.
And we can also take this to things that are not mysteries. I think mysteries, as well as big fantasy novels, are allowed to have those story questions of, will we stop the bad guy? Will what happened to this? Where did this come from? But if you're looking at romance, like the story question will be, will he get over his childhood trauma and be able to date her? And although we know in romance the answer to that is yes, that question of how he gets there is that what drives the tension of what's filling inside this person. What do we need them to do in order to get there? And I think that ties into our discussion of what needs and wants are, which we can get back to a little bit better when we talk about what our talk was, but that you need the characters to have some goals, but they may not be real goals. Like she described the want as potentially a false goal that is keeping them off of their true goal of how are we driving the character forward at any given point in time or things that you want to be keeping in mind, because when we start talking about binary endings, it has to do with that of did they succeed or fail at their goal. And if in this chapter I wanted to go get gas, but then I couldn't, there's the success or failure of going to the go get gas.
If the binary button, the way she described it, or binary ending, the way she described it, is maybe you do get the gas, which is great. Yes, mission accomplished, but how does that lead you to the next scene?
Yeah.
Whereas there are other types of binaries where it's like, no, you don't get the gas, but someone knows that you can't get anywhere. And they're like, well, your car's kind of stuck there, but I have a bicycle you could borrow if you need to get to the next town to get some help. And you're like, well, now my journey is me biking at night from a sketchy gas station. Maybe not the journey you want, but it is a way to create complications that open up new possibilities.
Yeah. So to speak more specifically, like she talked about these binary endings as in yes and no. Did they achieve their goal, yes or no? And so the hard yes and no is like, yes, goal achieved, no obstacles, complete satisfaction, great. No is the character completely fails to get what they want, completely blocked. Mr. Darcy, no, you don't get to marry me. And so from there, we're thinking plot progression or plot stopping. And from these other versions, we can think about, okay, well, then what else is going to keep us going? So if the answer is yes, then we've resolved something, but then what else is going to happen? Yes, but the character gets what they want, but that success creates a new problem, maybe.
Or the reverse of no and they don't get what they want, but something else opens out as like a runner-up opportunity that they can
Yeah,
pursue instead. And it's not that you can't have yes moments, although like the yes, you're complete, everything's done is probably better saved for like the climax where things have finally gone right. And
yeah,
the same thing with a no, and there's no other like conjunction, just no. You got shut down is maybe something that leads into the dark night of the soul, where they've sort of hit their biggest crisis of faith and they got to regroup anyway because they've been shut down so hard. But if you write a book where everybody gets a yes all the time, or most of the time, it becomes boring because there's no tension. Whereas the flip can also be problematic, where if it's the binary, is just no, explanation mark, no,
yeah.
because people get tired of reading people who fail all the time. Like you have to have a balance, even in a book that's grimdark or something, where there is some success in a try fail cycle, or else people will just be like, well, the odds are completely impossible. We're only halfway through the book. Nothing even kind of a win has happened for this character. I'm bored. So there is
Yeah,
this
and also you're
balance
not
too.
progressing towards the goal at any point. There's just no, 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 no. And then if it's yes at the end, like it has to be such a big counterbalance to that. And it's usually not. And this is where I get mad sometimes when I'm reading Enemies to Lovers, even though I said in the last week that is one of my favorites, is that they aren't doing progression. So it's just like no, 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 sex. And so it's not it's not entertaining to me is that they want to build the tension, and that's where the tension builds in that kind of thing is where those little yeses along the way that you kind of move them towards it. And so read this is how you lose the time more. There's one of those things where you think about this. And it's very interesting to me right now because I'm trying to edit my manuscript. And there are times when I'm like, I really love this line at the end of the chapter, but I didn't feel like it was a very good chapter ending. And now I can articulate why I had that feeling. And I was like, well, maybe I'll leave it there because it's well worded and people like that. But it gives me a framework by which to say, okay, in these endings, I have a hard no. In this ending, I have a no, but. In this one, I have this. And then on this one, it's really well worded, but what is happening? So then I can reframe that towards like, how do I lead that into them turning the page, the next chapter?
And that's really important too, because people struggle with sagging middles and they struggle with having enough in between like onset and eventual success or failure of the character achieving or not their goal at the end, that sometimes it seems, if not aimless, just that there's a lot of energy missing. And I think if you think about in terms of these binaries, especially the yes but or the no and, then you think about, okay, my character has this, there's some kind of setback or something happened to them and not the way they were planning. How are they going to actively regroup, rethink their strategy, and make a new plan to push onwards so the
Hmm.
characters become reactive? I find also as an editor, a lot of times it feels like my characters are like feathers on the wind, and they'll react to things lackadaisically, but they're not the ones pushing and planning and reacting to things deliberately. They're just letting it happen, and that can be very disengaging for readers.
And that takes us to like big closings because the
Hmm.
yes, no, or like she was talking about them specifically as endings to chapters because you're thinking episodic of like this episode, this episode, except it's not, it's binge watching TV. So it's all the same story. So it works very well now that we have this binge watching model to compare it to. But when you're talking about closings of the actual book, you're thinking in the yes, no, but what are you leaving open? Where have you answered the story questions and not answered the story questions? So she described the first one as a closure of like where you get all closure, all questions answered, all satisfaction, all is well. A little ease harder to come back from that one to a second book, but in the 80s and 90s, they didn't have a problem because they're like, okay, here's the next adventure. It's a different villain. But these days, everybody wants a Dark Lord who is the overarching whatever. So you have your closure ending, which is very satisfying. And I'm going to say that in Half a Soul, that series, they do a pretty good job with the closer ending and still having multiple books because they have these other characters out there banging around doing stuff. You could be like, what happened to that little orphan they adopted? We're going to get a story for her later, but that doesn't mean that this one isn't completely closed. So it's a useful strategy, especially in cozy, I think.
Yeah. And I think if you're literally writing a standalone, you'd hopefully want to end with closure. The second type of closing she really was cautious about, which I understand because she was talking about there is this type of overall closure for a book that's a cliffhanger. And we've talked a lot about that before because we've edited books where it doesn't even, have a cliffhanger where the scene is completed, it cuts off mid-scene, like sometimes even mid-sentence, and then there feels like this onus that the reader would have to buy the next book to even have a completion to the final scene they were reading in a book. And that can be very frustrating. And I think Johnson was pretty clear that you can do cliffhangers, but A, there's a lot of blowback and there can be a lot of
Yeah.
frustration from readers. And B, she would not recommend doing that unless you basically had written a duology or trilogy up front and we're going to rapid release them within a month or so. So that way there wasn't a
Yeah.
year or a year and a half between cliffhangers, because that would definitely have the issue of making people very frustrated and maybe, if not review bombing, just not reading you again. So you can cliffhanger, but if you really are invested in that, A, take into account that people have a lot of strong opinions on that as just a concept. And there's going to be a knee jerk section of the population who aren't going to want to read that no matter what. And B, that if you are doing it, you should do it with a rapid release strategy because people do not like a year between books where they ended on a cliffhanger. They don't.
No. And I would also recommend that if you're going to end on a cliffhanger, it be the second book in your series and not the first, because you need that
Mhm.
first book to show them that you can be trusted enough to give a satisfying ending. Whereas I think that some where they end on a cliffhanger and then they eventually get to the ending and that you haven't proven to me that you're going to take care of me as a reader, so I'm not really going to trust you enough to continue reading your books. So I think that's why people get cranky about the cliffhangers, especially because in romance, in romantasy, in these high tension series, you're able to put a lot of your emotional investment on the line because you know that there will be some kind of satisfactory resolution. And then if it's not there, then that's broken and you're angrier than you would have been if it were just a bad novel and you'd stop reading a few chapters in. Um,
Yeah, it's also a time commitment of, as a reader, I've put in hours and like 300 pages of work, and you literally cut me off with no resolution halfway through a
try
scene. Like it
500,
feels,
600.
yeah, it
1,000. Like
feels
these are
difficult.
very long books at this point, and not it's like as not always, but the books on the ones that are not being published by the main houses that are trying to cut pages, they are so long. And I want to spend all this time to be unsatisfied. It doesn't have to be the ending that I was expecting necessarily,
It needs
but
to
I
be
do want
some
it to
kind of
be
an
an
ending.
ending. Okay, moving on. The third type is what she called the open door. And I was describing this as a cliffhanger for the Hunger Games, but I think this is actually what she's doing. Because with the open door, you're resolving the main conflict or answering the main story question. That is done. You have finished something, you have closed a loop, and then you leave other questions unanswered or you introduce a new conflict. So if we look at the very ending, and this is again the second book in the series, very ending of the second book in the Hunger Games trilogy, she has finished that games. The quarter quell of like she has finished that game. She has survived. Hamish survived. Plutarch survived. And she's on a little hovercraft. Great. That is concluded. But then we have two elements of tension. One, they blew up District 12, and two, Peeta has been captured. So we have more problems that have started as new problems, but we did close the loop on what she was doing. They didn't stop in the middle of the scene where they were trying to figure out what the heck to do with that stupid tree. They didn't stop there. She stopped where you finished the part of the loop and then introduced the main conflicts for the next book. And you do that in the second book of the series because we trust you now because everybody, well, anybody who wrote them, people like the first one and then they want to know what's going on with the next character. So we're invested, but we trust you to finish. And the third book's coming out soon, so it's okay.
Yeah. I feel like that is the difference, is that even if it's a book that is like episodic, okay, bear with. But if you're reading Animorphs books, each book, it's a middle grade series, but have the sort of big mission, the big thing they're going to destroy, or the big win they're trying to get on the Yerk army for that particular book. The only exceptions are there's one trilogy in the middle of it, and the last six books are written as Cliffy's because it's like the end run. But if I read a book and they didn't finish blowing up their power source. And I'm like, well, we were supposed to do that. And we just kind of stopped the book midway. There's this idea where you keep the greater mystery or the greater arcs or the greater questions multiplying, but their particular mission of the day got completed. Their particular, this is their goal. They're supposed to be, helping free these people from a cage down underground or whatever. Like they're trying to get through that like goal. You can't just be, well, I had some plot thread started and then I just kind of stopped. Again, it's all about that trust. And then you're right. If you're going to have anything that might even have open-ended threads on an ongoing series, it's something where you may feel more confident closing a loop and asking more questions as you get further into the series and you've already built trust in books 1 and 2 where people know the big stuff is getting answered mostly. But yeah, it's a lot about trust building too, because you want to close some loops for people and have some type of sense of closure in an open door, even though like the next big mystery or the next big question is getting open for the next book.
And in a gentler version of this, she talks about what she does in what we would consider an interconnected series. So some of the examples that we've been giving are an overarching plot over multiple books in an interconnected series. And this is something with romance where these are the same characters, but they're following up with different elements of it. And so you have seven, I don't know what her thing was, like seven brothers working in a marsh, and they're all going to get married by the end of this whole interconnect. It's the whole thing with Bridgerton too, of like these interconnected novels. You can read them individually, but they introduce the characters as they go. So the way that she talks about it is that she makes sure is that she closed that loop for the main couple and introduce the character as you go, and the epilogue is where you can launch the story question for the next book because she knows that that one is coming out next and she wants them to pick up one after the other. And the concept for that is, I think, very important because I have read people who try to introduce the new couple a little too strongly in the main book, but I want the main book to be really focused on the main couple. So you don't want some other couple taking over their ending. Give them their good ending and then, whatever. Sometimes people will do this just by introducing them as interesting characters throughout. Well, that's a good strategy, but her strategy in particular is one where she makes use of a potential epilogue to say, okay, did you like this brother? He's next.
Yeah, and I think that's important too. Like I've definitely read books where it is an interconnected style. They really tangle up the B plot with the couple they're setting up to the point that sometimes the B plot rivals the A plot for attention. So you don't feel like in the first book, because they're trying to set up the best friend is going to get her own book next. They end up doing that thing where they cross the line and focus too much on the best friend. And all of a sudden you're like, well, I just wish I was reading that book right now. So
Yeah.
there is that balance of like you're going to open up and maybe the epilogue after you've built the best friend as a realistic, like fleshed out character in her own right, albeit a supporting one, versus basically book one is kind of a mishmash of two plots at once, which loses focus. So some of the other sessions that they had included some breakouts, and we had to split up at the time because we figured we'd cover more things that way. But there was one by Tian Kim Lam that was writing inclusive sex scenes that I got to go to. And it wasn't to be funny or like flippant, like a play-by-play of sex scenes, but it was more advice for how to think about aspects of sex and consent and inclusivity as you write, which sometimes I think can be foreign concepts depending on where the author's written before and the type of experience they've been bringing in. So some of the big takeaways from that were literally first that often, especially because a lot of romance is centered towards a cishet female gaze, that it's often been billed as like there's kind of one holy grail of sex scenes, which is penetrative penis and vagina sex. And that there's a lot of different ways for different conformations of bodies and bodies with different abilities and different types of, male, 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 female, 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 poly, to have different types of sex of all types. And like, you know, what sex would be depending, or even intimacy, depending on what type of character you have. People who are more asexual or aromantic on a gray scale may even just being emotionally intimate with someone could be considered part of a sexual experience panoply. I think that was one part. I think one thing she also was pretty consistent about throughout the talk was thinking about the idea that if you have a character from like a marginalized identity and how that affects them isn't just like in one scene. If you're trying to be inclusive, that part of their identity affects, yes, the physical sex scenes and physical intimacy, but it also affects parts of who they are. It's not just something that's just tacked on because you're trying to learn to experiment with that or you thought it might be interesting. It's really inherent to who they are and how they operate in the world. And then I think she's also very good about thinking about, what kind of sex aids are needed. For example, lube isn't just for one or two certain situations. It can help not just obviously in male for needs where like you just need things to not be really frictiony without going too far into detail, but think about women and women who have hit menopause or women who may not have, hormonal issues where they may also need lube. And like think about sometimes things like that or sex toys, especially if you may have a male partner who has blood pressure issues or has issues where they need to have that as well and can't always just be at full mast. Just things of like not just thinking about things as toys or embellishments for sex, but how do they help accessibility for other people depending on their own needs. And then I think the most interesting part of the talk was her talking about consent. Not that we don't know what consent is. Obviously, where two people or however many people was in the arrangement, agree enthusiastically, vocally throughout to continue on with the various stages of intercourse. But I think she said that, people sometimes with writers in romance, they feel like it can be stilted to have continuing consent check-ins. And she says you think about the ways you can have characters continuing to give each other consent, whether it's asking each other, whether it's by touch, whether it's by kind of sharing a glance and nodding at each other. How can you find ways to make even the exchange of consent sexy and reassuring itself? Like you're going to keep asking it because the characters are going to keep asking because you're writing positive, inclusive sex scenes. But think about it not just as, oh, do you want to keep going? Yes. And like being locked into that one way. Think about all the other ways in life we ask each other and are clear with consent for each other and use it to reinforce each other. So those were some of the big takeaways from that talk. And I think if I had to give a bottom line for it, it's about thinking about inclusivity broadly and about something that's inherently woven in your text and not just added here or there during a sex scene or that one part that shows your character is, oh, part of that marginalized group, but it's foundational to who they are and how they operate in the world.
All right. Um, I went to the World Building for Romance Writers talk with Cassandra Rose Clark. I would start by saying this would have worked better if they'd given her like an afternoon and they turned it into a workshop. But she did try to have us sit and write for a couple of minutes in between some of these categories. The big takeaways from early on were that romance writers need to think of world building as something that transcends genre, especially if you have interconnected series or a larger continuous series. And people don't tend to think about world building for contemporary stuff, but anyone who's watched Gilmore Girls knows that you can build a world that people are going to be visiting over and over again because you have continuous places and characters within them that tell us how we live there, what's going on in that place. So your goal overall is trying to create a world where people want to live, and that world can be fantasy, magic, dragons, whatever, but it can also be a cozy small town where, or a bustling city that you find very energetic and interesting. So if you think of this talk as where do we start? How much do we need to get on the ground before you can just play in it? She starts with saying that you want to cover rules, places, power, rituals, food, and fashion. And underlying this is the idea of like layering butter or like scratching that id to give things that will make the reader the good sensations. That's, like you get to party, you get to eat food, you get to look at things that are pretty, and that helps. When we talk about each one of those categories, rules has to do with like how stuff works. So this might largely impact fantasy world building where we are thinking about what are the rules to the magic system, how do your specific vampires work, etc. But then from there, you're thinking about details of specific settings that you will see over and over. So if we go back to Buffy the Vampire Slayer, you have the location of the library and all the details in there. Or if you're in a small town in a cozy fantasy, the setting of the bakery where these things happen. You might even go into climate as a predictive force within this because you can apply that to both fantasy and cozy. What is the climate like here? What are the details around this that would help us? From there, you go into power systems, which can be, okay, is this an oligarchy of the elite? Is it a monarchy? But in a small town, you might think, okay, is the HOA the system of power here? What are the unspoken rules of power? Who has formal power, as in the mayor, or informal power, aka privilege? And you can detail in that. Rituals have to do with things that happen over and over. So when I talk about this in my own classes, it has to do with what major life events do we look at from birth to death? Do people celebrate birthdays? Do they have a quinceañera? Do they have weddings? What are the main things along the lifespan? But it can also be yearly rituals of they have a yearly pickling festival because they have a very long winter, so they spend a time hanging out with each other and making sure they prepare all the food, and it's a party. These are things that you can throw in there to create some texture. And then finally, you have food and fashion because who doesn't want to read scenes about delicious food? But fashion in itself can reflect some of those other elements, especially clothing tells you about the climate as well as economic resources and power differentials. So those are some basic things that you can put into play. And then you just jump into the setting. She didn't say this, I'm saying this, and I'm building off of what she was talking about. You jump into the setting, you start playing around, and once you know your characters, you work backwards again. Once you know them a little more, you have to say, okay, well, if this is the power situation, how does that impact what they're wearing? If this is what they eat, where did this food come from? You start Googling, like, how do you feed goats? And so you're thinking about what are the bits and pieces that need to go into that world building is basically where it is.
Yeah, I was just made me laugh, and you're like, well, maybe the HOA has power. Anybody who's ever dealt with an HOA knows that they're definitely the dictators of your neighborhood. So there's definitely a power struggle in that. Then there were two keynotes, one that was kind of like a lunch keynote, and then one was sort of like the wrap up, I guess. And so Christine Gunderson was the lunch one, and she talked about the 5 stages of being a writer. She had been a reporter, and then she had worked on Capitol Hill as a press secretary before retiring to take care of her kids, like be a stay-at-home mom. And I think that really colored her talk in that she needed something when she did retire as an outlet, so she wasn't just only immersed in small kid care, and she had something that was an outlet for her as a writer because she'd already been both a reporter and a press secretary, so she had written all the time. But I think her journey was really interesting because she mentioned, she got involved with, I believe, the Washington Romance Writers, because it was a coalition of Chesapeake romance writers, Virginia romance writers, and Washington romance writers all put this on together as a trifecta of groups. But she talked about her experience with that and getting mentoring and working with other writers and getting the support in the frame of basically she wrote 6 books, and a couple of them did get her agent representation, but it wasn't until her 6th book that the agency was also able to get someone from Amazon, their Montlake, I think, imprint, which is women's fiction, finally was interested in something she had written. And that's when she finally was able to get that book published and then submit to them two other ideas on essentially proposal. And another one of those was accepted and should be coming out this year as well. But the journey of her story was, at first she was at home and she was with her kids. And her first thing she did was start a book she just didn't feel confident in at the time, where she was writing kind of almost autofiction, but about a woman who had retired from being a reporter and what it was like now, this change and transition in her life to be raising small children. But then maybe towards when her kids were sort of middle school age, she had put that aside and then got the bug again to write. And this time she was more into writing dystopian YA fiction. So she did a couple of dystopian YAs. They didn't really get her a lot of attention, or like Agent Bites, and she submitted them and then she changed around. I think she mentioned in the middle of that was like a story that was a World War II story that was about like a younger woman. Like I think it was also a YA that was like a YA kind of inspired by true events about a freedom fighting girl in Scandinavia during the Nazi occupation. And she'd written this other book that she was really invested in, but it was at the end of the day about a cultural experience that she wasn't a part of. I think it was something set in Southeast Asia, but I can't remember what it was about. Um, and so she kind of just hopped between different genres as she was inspired. And eventually she had the agents, but she couldn't sell a lot of the YA stuff she was trying to get interest in, not because it wasn't well written, but how the market is and fluctuates. But finally, her agent said, you need to sit down and write something you really feel connected to personally. So she brushed off the pages from that book she started like 15 years ago or 20 years ago. That was really a reflection of how she felt at the time, essentially transitioning from being a full-time working woman to being a mom. And that became the basis for her women's fiction that got the deal with Amazon Montlake. So I think it was more the story of I wrote essentially 6 different books and went through all that heartache and all that process before the final one really popped off and got me that foot in the door with a publishing house. And I think it was the perspective of if she had quit at any time in the last 15 years, she finally would have gotten that yes after half a dozen no's. And also that her writing really started to connect with people when she was writing parts of it that were true and authentic to herself. And then the other speaker, who was kind of the last 20 minutes to close us out after all the other sessions, was Kathy Maxwell from the Virginia Romance Writers, who was talking about our true work. Hers was very much centered on the theme of community, about people who write have very different brains. We need community with each other because we're the only people who like see a woman go into the woods from the parking lot and start unraveling this whole murder mystery or illicit affair in our heads and tell ourselves these really complicated stories and then have no one to share them with but other writers. But also the same sentiment that, there's a lot of ups and downs with writing. And she started her writing journey in the early 90s, and it's been this sort of growing with it and learning how to reinvent and stick with it and stick with your community, because she started 30 years ago, but most people she knew have eventually dropped out by attrition because it's such a hard business, or they didn't feel as supported within their community, so they didn't have that backbone to go back to when things got difficult. Hers was also a lot of emphasis on that, needing to reinvent and re-educate yourself and just be flexible. For example, she happens to Maxwell be or is a Regency writer or historical romance writer, which, if you didn't know, has been in a big state of tumult because last month Harlequin announced that for the first time they wouldn't be publishing a monthly Regency romance, historical romance line at all. So it's a big shift for them, and now she's got to pivot and go indie. But if I would summarize Maxwell's talk, it's you need the community of other writers. There's going to be a lot of ups and downs in this business, and you have to be willing to re-educate yourself and reinvent as the market changes, or you're going to not be able to stay for 30 years. So both talks were very helpful.
And then, we had our own thing. We talked. Our projector
Yeah.
did not work. There
But
was a
Midnight was
lot.
super prepared, so we were mostly okay. We had really extensive notes. That was very
My
helpful.
anxiety did us well that day. We had a lot of sub points of the different types of editors, things that we've talked about on this podcast before, so you know it. So, of the thrust that we have, that we'll talk about some small things because we can't show you visuals of some of it had to do with making sure that you review your own manuscript before paying someone else to see it. And what that's going to get you and what that looks like of like basically making sure that you set it enough aside for enough time that you can read through it on your own and do a couple of drafts so that you have everything where you need it to be before you try to get an expert opinion so that you're not sending your editor down random rabbit holes and paying them extra to do it because a lot of them will get paid by the word or by the hour. So if you're doing that, then you're costing yourself extra money and then also not getting the amount of focus that you need on the story that you're eventually going to want to tell.
Yeah, and I think that's important because it sounds really direct, but the editor's going to get paid either way. That's going to help pay them part of their rent or whatever, but you may be out, especially since editors charge per word most of the time, the $1,000, the $800 for editing your manuscript when it's only in a first or second draft mode. And so what you're getting is the editor is fixing plot holes or inconsistencies or bigger macro issue stuff, even on a dev edit that you probably could have caught yourself. So you're not getting that deeper read. You're getting cheated out of the real level of developmental editing you could have if you'd already gone through at least 3 or 4 drafts and maybe had a beta or a close trusted critique partner look at first. And it's really about what maximizes the experience for you and makes it most important for you to get the kind of editing you're hoping you're paying for. If it's already a bit of a mess that you meant to go back and fix before you send it off, then you're really cheating yourself.
Yeah. The other thing that we talked about that we could discuss quickly here is goals, motivation, and conflicts, because that is something that you can self-edit on your position after you finished your book. You can, after you've given it time to rest, read back through it and see if it's really clear what motivates your characters, what they want to do, and what's stopping them from doing it. So when we talk about goals, goals change from chapter to chapter, but do they have an overarching goal? And what's stopping them financially, socially, magically? Like, what's keeping us from finishing the book in chapter 5, basically? And do we know why they make the choices they make? They don't have to make good choices, but we need to know why they're making their choices. And is that layered in well enough? Is your character well developed enough? Often that character that's not well developed may be the bad guy or the side character, but sometimes we get books wherein the female lead does not have enough development. And I don't know anything about this girl other than she finds the lead hot. So we need more. And you can probably establish that within the first 2 or 3 chapters of who
Yeah.
this person is. Like, why are they making their choices?
Yeah, and I think if, like you were mentioning, they don't have to be good choices necessarily. If you go back to a lot of people and just people you know in real life or yourself, you're like, I make all bad choices. That was dumb. But like they do need to be set up in a way that we can understand them. Maybe we're like, gosh darn it, girl, get your stuff together. Like if you sat down and watched that TV show Fleabag or whatever. But
Mhm.
you need to understand where they're coming from. And I think when we talk about GMC, the goals, motivation, and conflict, most of the time people can set up what the goal is. Like, okay, it's a sports romance. She wants to win the big game or whatever, or they can set up the conflict of the rival team is in her way. But I think it's harder to layer in the motivations about why they want what they want and why they react the way they do. But that's often the most important part of GMC. Because if I don't understand at least why the character's reacting how they do, then A, I'm going to become more frustrated with them more quickly. But also, they're not going to feel fleshed out as a real person because most people have complicated reasons for why they do what they do, whether it's outside economic pressures, whether it's how they were raised and like upbringing, a mixture of their temperament and their personality. There's always a bunch of different factors at play for why a person makes the decisions they do. And I think if a character doesn't have that kind of motivational nuance built in, then they don't really feel like a realized character. They feel flat. So,
Yep.
and I guess that's about it from what we experienced and the different highlights and takeaways, not just from our talk at the Mid Atlantic Romance Writers inaugural conference, but definitely from some of the others. Did you have any parting thoughts or things you wanted to say before we close out midnight?
I did want to mention that I really wanted to go to Nikki Payne's talk about retellings, but we could not because we had to give our own, just throwing the name out there. But secondly, I do hope they have another one next year because one of the best things about it is that it's the romance writers take their craft very seriously, which means that it's generally a good experience.
Yeah.
in these smaller regional settings where people just get together and they just really want to talk about their craft. And people are pretty friendly. We basically had it on a college campus, so we were in college classrooms, and it gives you this sense of community while giving you also this day set aside of I get to think and talk about my craft today and I don't have to worry about anything else.
Yeah, it was really nice to meet the other writers and get to exchange socials and see what other books that people are working on and what gets them excited. Because you're right, it gets you excited as well. So I think that's what we have for today. I know we are just going to see Awesome Con as fun things. So if we come back with any stories of that or any writers we've up into there, just at their booth, that might be part of a new podcast. But we'll have something at least the next couple weeks. So until then, this is Midnight Voss and Margaret Bates saying good luck with all your writing. Thank you for joining the Otherlands Editing Podcast. Look for our next episode coming soon. And in the interim, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Also, if you want more information or want to connect, you can find Margaret Bates and Midnight Voss at our site, Otherlands Editing. Until next time, keep writing and keep refining your words.